Vikings get sold as explorers and warriors. Almost nobody talks about the uncomfortable parts, the rituals born from terror in the face of invisible death. The world where a fever wasn't a symptom, it was a spiritual attack. Where a cough wasn't just a cough, it was a curse spoken by a dead ancestor. Angry in their burial mound, we imagined them strong, fearless, masters of their world. But when a plague came, a sickness that moved like a phantom through a longhouse, killing children in their sleep, their response wasn't medicine. It was something far older, far darker. They didn't just pray to their gods, they sought to appease, to bargain with, and to physically repel the unseen forces they believed were strangling the life from their communities. And the things they did to stop that sickness, the desperate, profane acts performed in the flickering firelight, were more terrifying than any battle. Which of these practices are just tales, and which are etched into the very bones they left behind? The Viking world, stretching from the late 8th to the mid-11th century, was a world intimately familiar with death, but not always by the sword. Sickness was a constant shadow. Recent archaeological discoveries have shattered the myth of the perfectly robust Viking. A study published in the British Dental Journal Open in 2025, examining skulls from a Viking Age site in Varnum, Sweden, used CT scans to look beneath the bone. They found widespread chronic suffering. These weren't just warriors or injuries, they were rampant dental infections, so severe they would have caused constant and agonizing pain. They found evidence of deep sinus and ear infections that left their mark on the bone, conditions that today would be cleared with a simple course of antibiotics, but for them were a lifelong torment. This wasn't a society of superhumans, it was a population riddled with painful, debilitating ailments. They lived with a level of pain we can barely comprehend. And into this world of constant physical suffering came the plagues. We know now that smallpox, the great killer, was already rampant. Genetic analysis of Viking skeletal remains published in the journal Science in 2020 found the variola virus, the cause of smallpox, in 13 different individuals from across the Viking world. This pushes back the timeline of the disease by 1,000 years. And it proves the Vikings weren't just victims of it. Their vast trade and raid networks made them super spreaders. When a sickness like this hit a settlement, a disease with a 30% mortality rate that left survivors horrifically scarred, how did they fight back? They didn't understand viruses or bacteria. They understood spirits. Sickness was a hostile will. It was a malignant entity sent by offended ancestors, malicious spirits, or even the gods themselves. To stop it, you couldn't just rest and drink broth. You had to confront the supernatural. You had to perform rituals, some of which were deeply profane. Number 1, the appeasement of the mound. To the Norse, the dead were not gone. They were just elsewhere. And sometimes that elsewhere was very close. The belief was that the dead lived on in their burial mounds, the great earthen barrows that dotted the Scandinavian landscape. A powerful chieftain didn't just die. He became an ancestor, a hagbwai, or mound dweller. These ancestors were not benevolent ghosts. They were powerful, temperamental forces that had to be managed. They could protect their living kin, ensure good harvests, and bring prosperity. But if offended, they could bring ruin. And one of the most common forms of their displeasure was sickness. An inexplicable illness sweeping through a family was often the first sign that the ancestor in the nearby mound was angry. Perhaps their grave goods had been disturbed. Perhaps the family had neglected their duties. The response was not to tend to the sick. It was to tend to the dead. The first step was blot, sacrifice. This wasn't a quiet prayer. It was a ritual of blood and feasting. The family would gather at the mound, a place of immense spiritual power. An animal, perhaps a horse, a goat, or even a prized bull would be led to the site. Its throat would be cut. And the blood, the carrier of life force Tarex, would be collected in a bowl. This sacred blood, the hlaut, would then be sprinkled over the mound with a sprig of evergreen, a gesture of feeding and honoring the dead. The meat would be boiled in a cauldron over a fire pit right there, and the family would feast, sharing a meal with their dead ancestor, re-establishing the bond. This was a direct transaction. We give you life force in the form of blood and the honor of this feast, and you will remove the sickness from our house. The Icelandic sagas are filled with these accounts. In the Eyrbyggja saga, the shepherd Thorir falls ill and dies after the newly buried chieftain Thorolf Twistfoot becomes restless in his mound. Soon after, a plague begins to spread. The response is to appease the powerful dead. But sometimes, this wasn't enough. If the sickness persisted, it meant the ancestor was not just angry, they had become a malevolent entity, a draugr, and a draugr required a more profane solution. Number 2, the second death. When appeasement failed and the plague worsened, The Vikings resorted to a terrifying practice, killing the dead. If the mound dweller was believed to be the source of the pestilence, actively walking the land and spreading disease, the community had to perform a ritual execution of the corpse. This was a dangerous, sacrilegious act, a desecration of the highest order, but it was seen as a desperate necessity. A group of the bravest men, often led by a local chieftain or a powerful warrior, would go to the burial mound, sometimes waiting until night, the time when the Draugr was thought to be most active. They had to physically break into the tomb. The sagas describe these moments with chilling detail, the scraping of shovels against frozen earth, and the heave of the great capstone being pried away. Inside, they expected to find the corpse unnaturally preserved, perhaps bloated and blue, a sign of its undead status. The goal was to neutralize it, to give it the second death. The methods were brutal and varied. In the Laxdæla saga, the hero Hrut is forced to deal with his undead kinsman, who is terrorizing the household. He breaks into the mound, finds the corpse, and decapitates it. But even that wasn't always enough. The head had to be placed at the corpse's buttocks, a final, profane humiliation to ensure it could never rise again. In other accounts, the body was pierced with a stake, pinning it to the earth, or it was taken from the tomb, carried far away to a desolate place, and burned on a massive pyre until only ash remained. This ash would then be scattered in the sea or buried where no one would ever stumble upon it. Imagine the psychological weight of this act. These were not monsters. They were their own fathers, grandfathers, and chieftains. They were violating one of their most sacred trusts, the sanctity of the grave, to save their families from an invisible enemy. Archaeological evidence for this is subtle but compelling. Certain Viking Age graves show signs of post-burial disturbance. Skeletons have been found with their heads removed and placed between their legs, or with large stones pinning down their chests or limbs, all potential indicators of these anti-Draugr rituals. It was the ultimate act of profanity, born of utter desperation. If you value documented history that digs into the unsettling truths of the past, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. The research for this script is based on archaeological reports and primary sources like the Icelandic sagas. For instance, the analysis of disturbed graves and their connection to folklore is detailed in works like Neil Price's The Viking Way, Religion and War in Late Iron Age Scandinavia, which combines archaeological finds with literary accounts to reconstruct these belief systems. Now, back to the information. Number 3, the ritual of the well. When the sickness was not traced to a single angry ancestor but seemed to be a curse upon the entire community, the rituals became larger and more communal. The focus shifted from the burial mound to other sites of spiritual power, particularly wells and springs. Water was a potent symbol of life, a gateway to the underworld, and a place where offerings could be made directly to the gods or the land spirits, the Landvættir. At Trelleborg, one of the great Viking ring fortresses in Denmark, archaeologists discovered something chilling. In the years before the fortress was built, around the 9th to the 10th century, the site was used for ritual activities. Several deep wells were uncovered, and their contents tell a dark story. These were not ordinary wells for drinking water. They were sacrificial pits. In one well, designated Well 47, excavators found the skeletal remains of children. Strontium isotope analysis, a method that can determine the geological region where a person grew up, showed that these children were local to the area. They weren't foreign captives. They were from the community itself. Alongside them were the remains of animals, a young he-goat, a large dog, parts of a young cow, and a horse's hind limb. The way these remains were deposited suggests they were placed there while still fleshed, as complete or partial carcasses. This wasn't just a dumping ground for waste, it was a series of deliberate, intentional offerings. This was propitiatory sacrifice on a grand scale. Why sacrifice children and valuable livestock in a well? In a world without scientific medicine, a plague that killed the young would have been seen as a profound failure of the community to maintain favor with the gods of fertility and life. Perhaps Freya or Freyr. The response was to give the gods something of ultimate value, the young of their own species and the most important of their livestock. The well served as a direct conduit, a way to deliver the offering to the powers below the earth. It was a desperate, profane bargain, trading the lives of a few for the survival of the many. While we can't definitively link the Trelleborg wells to a specific plague outbreak, the nature of the sacrifices, young life given to appease the earth, is entirely consistent with a ritual response to a catastrophic loss of life from disease. Number 4, the weaponization of filth. The Vikings had a complex relationship with hygiene. On one hand, archaeological finds are rich with grooming tools, Combs made of bone and antler are some of the most common artifacts found in Viking graves. Tweezers and even small ear scoops for removing wax have been found. The English chronicler, John of Wallingford, writing in the 13th century Sagas, complained that the Vikings were too clean. He claimed they combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes often, which made them dangerously attractive to English women. The Old Norse word for Saturday, lagerdager, literally means washing day. Yet, we have a starkly contrasting account from the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who traveled with a group of Rus Vikings in the 10th century. He described them as the filthiest of Allah's creatures. He recounts a morning ritual where a slave girl would bring a large bowl of water to the chieftain, who would wash his face and hair in it, then blow his nose and spit into the same water. The bowl was then passed to the next man, and the next, each using the same foul water. From a modern perspective, this is a recipe for spreading disease. But in the Viking mindset, this shared filth might have had a profane purpose. In a world where sickness was a spiritual attack from an outside entity, shared bodily fluids could have been seen as a way of creating a communal magical defense. It was a way of binding the group together, making them a single, unified entity. Spittle, sweat, and other effluvia were believed to contain a part of a person's essence and power. By sharing the water, they were sharing their strength, creating a collective shield. Furthermore, in Norse magical belief, things that were considered disgusting or taboo often held great power. The medicine of the time was not about cleanliness, it was about potency. A remedy was often made to be deliberately foul-tasting and smelling, with the logic that the awful nature of the concoction would drive away the attacking spirit. This concept survived in Scandinavian folk medicine for centuries. So while Ibn Fadlan saw disgusting filth, the Vikings may have seen a necessary, if profane, act of group solidarity and magical protection against the invisible evils that brought plague. Number 5, Seiðr and the unraveling of fate. When sacrifices and desecrations failed, there was another path, magic. The Norse practiced a powerful and dangerous form of magic known as Seiðr. This was not simple spellcasting. It was a complex shamanic tradition that involved entering a trance state to communicate with spirits, see the future, and manipulate the very fabric of fate, the word. Practitioners of Seiðr, who were most often women called völar, singular vulva, held a position of both immense respect and fear in Viking society. When a plague struck, a community might turn to a vulva as their last resort. The ritual itself was a public performance. The vulva would sit on a high platform, a Seiðr, holding a staff, often topped with metal fittings and a pouch of charms. She would be surrounded by a choir of young women who would sing a special song, the Vardlakur, designed to call the spirits and help induce her trance. In this altered state of consciousness, the vulva was believed to travel the spirit roads to seek out the cause of the affliction. Was it a curse laid by an enemy? Was a god offended? Or was it simply an unraveling of the community's good fortune? Her diagnosis would determine the response. She might identify a specific spirit that needed to be appeased with a particular sacrifice, or she might perform a healing ritual, attempting to restore a lost part of a sick person's soul. But Seiðr had a darker, more profane side. It could also be used to curse. If the vulva determined that the plague was the result of a magical attack from a rival community or a specific enemy sorcerer, she could turn the magic back on them. She could perform a ritual to tangle their threads of fate, to send the sickness back to its source, or to inflict an even greater calamity upon them. This was a form of spiritual warfare. The sagas contain accounts of Seiðr being used to cause storms, induce madness, and bring about death from afar. This practice was considered somewhat unmanly for men to engage in, as it involved a level of spiritual receptiveness called ergi that was contrary to the masculine ideal. Yet even the god Odin, the highest of the Aesir, was a master of Seiðr, showing its immense power and importance. In the face of a plague, a community would not hesitate to use this spiritual weapon, engaging in a profane magical battle to save themselves, a concept utterly alien to our modern understanding of medicine. The use of hallucinogenic plants or fungi to achieve the trance state has been hypothesized, though direct evidence is scarce. However, the graves of some powerful women, believed to be völar, have been found to contain caches of henbane seeds, a powerful deliriant, pointing to the very real possibility that these rituals involved psychoactive substances to bridge the gap between worlds. The sheer desperation is hard to overstate. Imagine a small, isolated settlement in the depths of a Scandinavian winter. The longhouse is crowded, smoky, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, burning wood, and sickness. One child starts with a fever. then another. Soon, half the household is coughing, weak, their bodies covered in painful sores. The healer's remedies of boiled herbs and chanted charms do nothing. The local blot to the ancestors has failed. The fear is palpable. The sickness is not a natural process. It is an active, malevolent force hunting them in their own home. It is in this context of terror and helplessness that these profane acts become understandable. They were not born of casual cruelty, but of a frantic need to do something, to fight back against an enemy they could not see, using the only weapons they believed they had: blood, bone, and belief. The line between sacred and profane blurred and then vanished. Digging up your grandfather to stab him through the heart, sacrificing a child in a cold or dark well, or sharing a bowl of spit and phlegm were not acts of evil. They were a form of desperate, spiritual surgery, cutting away a part of their own humanity to excise the cancer of the plague. They were fighting a supernatural war, and in war, profane acts are often seen as necessary for survival. The evidence for these practices is scattered: a line in a saga, a disturbed grave, the bones in a well. But together they paint a picture of a society pushed to the absolute edge. They show us that behind the gleaming helmets and the dragon-proud ships was a deep-seated fear of the unknown, and a willingness to do the unthinkable to protect their own. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Commenting with your city helps us see how far these stories travel. Our understanding of these practices comes from a careful piecing together of folklore, saga literature, and archaeology. For example, the archaeological report: a ritual site with sacrificial wells from the Viking Age at Trelleborg, Denmark, published in the Danish Journal of Archaeology, provides the cold and hard data of the bones, while sagas like the Erbygja saga give us the narrative context for why someone might feel compelled to perform such an act. Now back to the information. The physical environment itself was a source of both life and death. The dense, dark forests of Scandinavia were not just sources of timber and game, they were alive with spirits. The landvetter, or landwights, were the unseen guardians of the earth, rocks, moors, and rivers. To build a house, clear a field, or even draw water from a stream without showing them proper respect was to invite their wrath. And like the ancestors, their wrath could manifest as sickness. A sudden plague could be interpreted as the land itself turning against the community. The response was to heal the relationship with the land. This involved rituals that acknowledged the power of the vetir. A farmer might leave a bowl of milk or a sheaf of grain by a prominent rock or an old tree believed to be the spirit's dwelling. For a more serious affliction, a full blot might be held out in the open. The blood of the sacrificed animal spilled directly onto the earth to feed it, to give back some of the life force that had been taken. This belief in the land's agency had a profane side. If a particular place was deemed to be the source of the sickness, a cursed spring, a haunted grove, the Vikings might attempt to cleanse it with violence. They might fell the trees, fill the spring with stones, or even attempt to kill the place with fire and iron. Iron, in particular, was believed to have apotropaic qualities capable of warding off evil spirits. Driving iron nails into a cursed tree or dropping iron objects into a blighted spring were acts of magical warfare against the land itself. The Icelandic law codes, the Gragas, contained sections that make it illegal to mock or insult the landvetter, indicating how seriously this belief was taken. A plague was not just a medical crisis, it was a diplomatic crisis with the spirit world, and sometimes diplomacy failed, and a more forceful. Profane intervention was deemed necessary. Death itself was a landscape with multiple destinations. It wasn't a simple heaven or hell. The Norse believed the soul was a complex entity made of several parts. Where you went after death depended on how you died. Warriors who died bravely in battle might be chosen by the Valkyries to go to Odin's Hall, Valhalla, or to Freya's field, Folkvanger. Those who drowned at sea were claimed by the giantess Ran. But the vast majority of people, those who died of sickness or old age, the straw death, were destined for Helheim. This realm, ruled by the goddess Hel, was not a place of punishment like the Christian hell. It was a gray, shadowy reflection of the world of the living. To die of plague was to be condemned to this inglorious end. This fear of a dishonorable afterlife fueled some of the most profane rituals. There was a belief that a person's life force could be harnessed, even after death. This is the root of what some scholars have called medical cannibalism in later Scandinavian folklore. The water used to wash a corpse was sometimes drunk by the living, in the belief that the unused life force of the deceased could be absorbed, providing protection against the very illness that killed them. The blood of executed criminals, who were believed to possess an excessive life force due to their unnatural deaths, was also considered a powerful medicine. While direct evidence of these practices from the Viking Age itself is limited, the underlying belief system, that life force is a tangible substance that can be transferred, is consistent with their worldview. In the face of a plague, the bodies of the dead were not just sources of grief and fear, they were a potential, if profane, resource. The idea of drinking water that had washed a smallpox victim is horrifying to us, but to someone who believed it could fortify their own spirit against the supernatural attacker, it might have seemed like a logical, if grim, necessity. This underscores the vast gulf between their understanding of the world and ours. Sickness was not a biological process to be managed with hygiene and quarantine. It was a spiritual battle to be won by any means necessary. No matter how profane, the very act of burial became a critical defense against the plague's spiritual onslaught. A normal funeral was a carefully managed transition, ensuring the deceased was content and wouldn't return to haunt the living. But plague victims were different. Their deaths were violent, unnatural, and they were considered at high risk of becoming malevolent draugr. These were not ghosts. A draugr was a reanimated corpse with superhuman strength and a malevolent hatred for the living. The sagas describe them with terrifying consistency. Their skin was corpse black or deathly pale, they reeked of decay, and they could shapeshift, travel through solid rock, and control the weather. The famous account of Glamour in the Grettis saga details how the undead shepherd terrorized a whole valley, breaking the backs of livestock and men, his laughter echoing in the winter darkness. To prevent a plague victim from becoming such a monster, their burial had to be deliberately deviant. Instead of being laid to rest with honor, they were disposed of in ways designed to incapacitate them. Archaeological finds of deviant burials from the Viking Age offer chilling clues. Graves have been found where the corpse is buried face down. The logic may have been that if the dead person tried to claw their way out, they would only dig themselves deeper into the earth, away from the world of the living. Other bodies have been found weighed down with large stones, not as grave markers, but placed directly on the chest, pelvis, or limbs, as if to physically pin the spirit to the grave. Decapitation was another method, with a head often placed between the legs or at the feet, a final humiliation to prevent the corpse from ever seeing its way back. In some cases, victims might not be buried in the community graveyard at all. They were taken to remote locations, bogs, marshes, or desolate coastlines, places considered to be on the border between the worlds. A bog burial, in particular, was a powerful act. The unique preservative qualities of the peat would have been noted, but more importantly, a bog was a liminal space, a gateway to the other world. Placing a body there was a way of trapping it between the land of the living and the realm of the dead, neutralizing its ability to cause harm. These were not funerals, they were containment protocols. The profanity lay in the deliberate denial of a proper burial, an act that stripped the deceased of their honor and risked their peace in the afterlife, all for the protection of the living. It was a brutal calculation made in the face of overwhelming fear. But what about the living sick? In the close confines of a longhouse, with multiple families living under one roof, an infectious disease was a death sentence for the community. While they lacked our concept of quarantine, they understood that sickness spread from person to person. When magical and ritual cures failed, a community could turn to the ultimate profane act against their own kin, expulsion. A family struck by plague might be shunned, with food left for them at a distance. In the most extreme cases, the longhouse itself could become a tomb. The doors might be barred from the outside, sealing the sick inside to live or die together. This was a violation of the most sacred bonds of Norse society, the duties owed to family and clan. To abandon one's own was unthinkable. Yet a plague could make the unthinkable necessary. There is no saga that openly boasts of such an act, for it was an act of profound shame, but the fear it represented is woven into their folklore. Tales of lone, plague-ridden farmsteads, where the inhabitants became draugr and haunted the land, served as a stark warning of what happened when a community failed to contain an outbreak. Leaving your family to die in a sealed house was a profane choice, but it was a choice between one family and the entire village. The healthy armed themselves with magic. The Vikings understood the power of symbols, and they used them as spiritual armor. The Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, was one of the most powerful. Pendants shaped like the hammer are one of the most common Viking Age finds. While often seen as a symbol of martial prowess, Thor was also a protector of mankind against the forces of chaos, the Jötnar or giants, which included the invisible giants of plague. Wearing a Mjolnir amulet was not just a declaration of faith, it was an active ward, a piece of spiritual protection. In the face of an epidemic, the production and wearing of these amulets would have intensified. They might have been placed over the doorways of longhouses, carved into the timbers of a bed, or tied to the harnesses of livestock. The material mattered. A hammer of iron, the metal that could repel spirits, was more potent than one of bone. A hammer of silver, a metal of purity and value, was a powerful offering to the god. Runes, the Norse script, also held immense magical power. Each rune had a name and a phonetic value, but also a deeper, a cosmic meaning. Certain runes were associated with protection, healing, and life. The rune Algiz was a powerful symbol of defense, representing the horns of an elk or the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree. Uruz was the rune of the aurochs, a wild ox, symbolizing untamed strength and vitality. A rune master could carve these symbols onto pieces of wood, bone, or metal to create a talisman. In a plague-stricken village, a rune master might be called upon to carve protective staves for every household, or to inscribe them on the bodies of the sick, a desperate attempt to write a new fate for them, to overwrite the story of the sickness with a story of healing. The sagas speak of using runes to cure sickness, but also warn of the dangers of using them incorrectly. A misplaced rune could turn a healing charm into a deadly curse. This was potent, dangerous magic, and its use would have been a serious and profane undertaking, meddling directly with the hidden forces that governed the world. Let's not forget the role of animals in this spiritual war. Certain animals were believed to have special connections to the spirit world. The horse was sacred to many gods and was a powerful symbol of travel between the worlds. The sacrifice of a horse, as seen in the Trelleborg Wells, was a significant offering. But animals could also be used as spiritual scapegoats. It is conceivable that a community might perform a ritual where they symbolically transferred the sickness of the village into an animal, perhaps a goat or a bull. The animal would be decorated with symbols of the plague, led through the village to absorb the malevolent energy, and then driven out into the wilderness to die, carrying the affliction with it. This practice is seen in other cultures and fits within the Norse magical framework of manipulation and transference. Dogs were also important. They were often buried with their owners, perhaps as guides or protectors in the afterlife. In the context of a plague, a dog might be sacrificed and buried at the threshold of a house or the boundary of a village, its spirit intended to act as a supernatural guardian, to ward off the malevolent entities that carried the disease. The discovery of ritually buried dogs at various Viking sites lends credence to their role in these protective, and to our eyes, profane, boundary-setting rites. Every aspect of their world, their homes, their dead, their animals, their very language was weaponized in the desperate fight against the invisible terror of plague. This constant battle against unseen forces shaped their psychology. The fatalism often associated with the Vikings, the famous embrace of a glorious death in battle, takes on a new light. Perhaps it was not just a warrior's creed, but a response to a world where death could come at any time, not just from an axe, but from a phantom fever. In a world where your dead father could rise from his grave to kill you, where the land itself could turn against you, and where your fate was a thread that could be cut by a hostile sorcerer, perhaps the clean, swift death of battle seemed a preferable, more honorable end. The profane rituals they performed were not the actions of a bloodthirsty people, but of a people who felt themselves to be living under constant siege from a world of spirits, monsters, and capricious gods. Their raids and explorations, often seen as pure aggression, might also have been driven by a desperate need to escape cursed lands, to find new homes where the ancestors were less angry and the soil was not saturated with sickness. What we imagine as the Viking Age was not a monolithic block of time. It was a period of immense change, culminating in the conversion to Christianity. This new religion offered a different kind of protection. It offered a single, all-powerful God who had triumphed over death and evil. It offered saints who could intercede on behalf of the sick, and holy water that could drive out demons. Compare the horror of breaking into your kinsman's tomb to decapitate his corpse with the quiet solemnity of a priest administering the last rites. Compare the chaotic, dangerous trance of the vulva with the structured, repetitive certainty of a Latin Mass. For a people exhausted by the constant, terrifying work of appeasing ancestors and fighting spiritual battles, the promise of a simpler, more powerful form of divine protection must have been incredibly appealing. The mass conversions of the 10th and 11th centuries were not just political. They were a response to a deep spiritual need, but the old ways died hard. The profane beliefs and practices didn't simply vanish, they went underground. Surviving for centuries in folk magic and rural traditions, the belief that sickness was a spiritual attack, the use of charms and amulets, the fear of the unquiet dead, these things lingered long after the last dragon ship was pulled ashore. They are the ghostly echoes of a time when a plague was met not with medicine, but with magic, and when the line between a healing ritual and a profane act was as thin as a whisper in a fever dream. The final, chilling truth is found not in a saga, but back in the bones. The same genetic studies that found smallpox in Viking remains also revealed something else. Many of the Vikings carried a gene that provided some resistance to HIV. This gene, CCR5-delta32, is thought to have become common in Europe because it also offered protection against a deadly hemorrhagic fever, or perhaps smallpox itself. The Vikings weren't just spreading plague, they were living through a storm of it so intense that it permanently scarred their DNA. Their profane rituals were the desperate screams of a people being reshaped, on a genetic level, by the very diseases they were trying to fight. They were not just fighting a war, they were the battlefield,